Reddit is known for its strange subcultures, but nothing compares to the terrifying true accounts shared by users who claim to have genuinely experienced the horror. We've compiled the top 5 most disturbing, high-ranking, and allegedly real horror stories from the deepest corners of the internet. Tales of relentless surveillance, deep-sea terror, stolen identity, and things that defy physical laws. These aren't creepypastas. These are the confessions of the psychologically shattered. Join us for a journey into the unknown where reality is stretched past the breaking point. From the former search and rescue operative who found a cabin that moves, to the communications expert who recorded a rhythmic sound from the Mariana Trench, these stories are the reason people lock their doors at night. This account comes from a user named silent_observer_404, posted 2 years ago on letsnotmeet. It describes a slow, suffocating descent into paranoia that began the night they moved into a new apartment complex in a quiet suburban town. The apartment was perfect, except for one thing. The windows of the opposing complex were directly across a narrow street. You could see into your neighbors' lives, and they could certainly see into yours. The first few weeks were fine. Then, silent_observer_404 started noticing a pattern. No matter what time of day or night, there was always someone, a different resident each time, standing at their window, looking directly across. Not gazing idly, but standing stock still, staring. At first, it was dismissible. People watched their neighborhood. But it became constant. They'd wake up at 3 a.m. and instinctively look across. In the window directly facing their bedroom, there would be a figure, sometimes a hunched old woman, sometimes a tall, pale man, simply watching. No lights on in their apartment, just the silhouette against the dim city light. Our users started covering their own windows with heavy curtains, a move that only intensified the tension. They realized that after the curtains were drawn, the figures across the way would gather. They could hear low murmurs and see the faint flicker of flashlights through the thin curtain fabric, not aimed at our user's apartment, but moving quickly amongst themselves. They were communicating about him. The climax of the story came one stormy night. A tree branch snapped, taking out the power on their side of the street. In the absolute darkness, silent_observer_404 stood silently in their pitch-black living room. The darkness was total. There was no way anyone could see in. But then, the flashlight started. Not the faint flickering from before, but bright beams that snapped on from every single window across the street. Dozens of them, perfectly synchronized. They were all aimed not at our users' curtained windows, but at the crack between the curtain and the wall. And the light was accompanied by a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from across the street. Not a random tap, but a steady, deliberate beat, like a signal. Frozen by the intensity of the illumination and the calculated rhythm of the sound, the user realized they weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. The watchers weren't people. They were something else, something collective, waiting for a chance to break their way in. The story ends with the user fleeing the apartment that same night, never looking back, and swearing that the entire complex watched their every move until their car turned the corner. The neighbors never stopped watching. This terrifying, technical account was shared on a niche sub for deep-sea salvage and recovery by a user claiming to be a former communications officer for a private marine exploration company. The title: I monitored the audio from the darkest place on Earth. The story revolves around an unmanned, deep-sea exploration vehicle, an ROV, sent to examine a newly discovered trench near the Mariana region. The ROV was equipped with high-definition cameras and sensitive hydrophones, capable of picking up sound in the crushing blackness of the abyss. For the first few days, the expedition was routine: geological samples, strange bioluminescent organisms, and the occasional seismic tremor. The only audio was the hum of the ROV's thrusters and the crackle of static. Then, they sent the ROV deeper than any man had ever gone, descending into an unexplored sub-trench. At approximately 10,800 meters, the audio began to change. The ROV's onboard sonar suddenly picked up a huge, anomalous ping, something impossibly massive moving downward alongside the vehicle. The communications officer, our user, initially suspected a large whale. But the sheer size and speed of the echo dismissed that theory immediately. Then came the audio, a sound that defied all known acoustics. It was a low-frequency pulse, immensely powerful, but it wasn't a natural sound like a tectonic plate shift or a methane bubble. It was rhythmic. It was calculated. Over the next hour, as the ROV hit the absolute bottom and began its sample collection, the rhythm intensified. It became a pattern. The pilot reported seeing nothing on the cameras, just the black void. But the hydrophones were screaming. The sound started to modulate, the pulses stretching and warping into something that, while clearly non-linguistic, felt uncannily like effort. Like something incredibly massive was dragging itself through the ultra-dense water. The final transmission, recorded by the user, lasted only 15 seconds. The rhythmic pulsing suddenly stopped. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then, a single, high-pitched screech, a sound unlike anything heard before, described as wet and metallic, tearing through the water. Immediately following the screech, the ROV's signal was completely severed. Not a technical malfunction, but a total rupture. The ROV was gone. The communication officer, haunted by the experience, was forced to sign multiple non-disclosure agreements. He never spoke about the sheer sense of dread that permeated the control room that night, the shared, unspoken terror that they had not found something geological, but something alive, something that was disturbed by their light and their sound, and retaliated with a force that obliterated their billion-dollar machine in the darkest, deepest place on Earth. The sound of something that large, moving with intent, is what drove the user to confess the story. This strange, fragmented story was shared by a user who worked as a freelance programmer specializing in niche, high-security cloud storage solutions for ultra-wealthy private clients. The user admitted in his deleted profile to being borderline psychotic before this experience, but it recalibrated his reality entirely. The client was known only as Mr. S, an elderly man who lived in a massive, isolated mansion overlooking the Pacific. Mr. S hired the programmer to set up a unique, completely offline, biometric locked server. The only data on it was a series of encrypted files, each protected by a unique facial scan. The programmer quickly realized the peculiarity of the system. The files weren't locked with Mr. S's face. They were locked with the face of a different man for each file. 10 separate files, 10 separate faces. The programmer, intrigued, asked Mr. S about this bizarre security measure. Mr. S, with a cold smile, explained that he was a collector of identities. He claimed to have bought the rights to these 10 men's lives, their medical records, their legal standing, everything, and their absolute, permanent likenesses. He said he had paid them enormous sums of money to voluntarily disappear. The true horror began when the programmer completed the setup and was preparing to leave. Mr. S offered him a drink, a single glass of amber liquid. The conversation shifted. Mr. S casually remarked that he had one last identity to secure, one final file that required a unique key. He then presented a document, a contract already prepared, for the programmer to sell his own identity, his past, his life, and his face, for a sum that would guarantee generational wealth. The contract had an unsettling clause, full and permanent surrender of all associated likeness, for use in the digital and physical realm. The programmer politely refused, citing his own family. Mr. S did not react negatively. He simply pointed to the far corner of the opulent, empty room. There, standing stock still, was a man. He had the same build, the same haircut, and was wearing an identical shirt to the programmer. Then, the man turned his head. His face was a horror, smooth, blank, and waxen, like a department store mannequin's head crudely sewn onto a human neck. He had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just flawless, empty skin where a face should be. Mr. S smiled and said he declined too. But the likeness is the price, whether you agree or not. Some prices are paid later. The programmer fled that night, leaving all his tools behind. He claims he has changed his appearance completely, never uses his real name, and lives in constant fear. The truly disturbing part? He swears that sometimes, in dense crowds, he catches a glimpse of a familiar face, his old face, just for a split second, looking back at him with a chilling, cold, and calculated stare. The face was just the key to the vault. This chilling submission came from a user who was a researcher working on historical preservation for a remote coastal museum. The artifact was an obscure, leather-bound journal belonging to a lighthouse keeper who manned a notoriously remote post in the North Atlantic in the 1890s. The keeper, identified only as Thomas, maintained detailed logs of the weather, ship sightings, and his mental state. The first 2 volumes were meticulous, if lonely. The third volume, starting in the autumn of 1898, became something else entirely. The entries began to focus on the light itself. Thomas wrote about the light starting to sing after midnight, a high, almost inaudible frequency that seemed to vibrate his teeth and skull. He initially thought it was the gears, but the sound seemed to respond to his presence. Over the next few weeks, the entries became more frantic. Thomas claimed the light had stopped being a source of guidance and had become a source of vision. When he looked into the powerful beam, he saw things in the air, things that flew in the blackness just beyond the glass. They were never given shape. He only described them as darkness given flight. The most disturbing entry came in December. He wrote that the flying darkness would sometimes land on the circular walkway outside the lantern room. They were small, wet, and clicked on the stone. He started leaving out dead fish he caught for them. He wasn't feeding them, he was appeasing them. The final 6 pages of the journal contained no legible words. Instead, they were filled with detailed anatomical sketches. They weren't of fish, or birds, or any creature known to man. They were drawings of creatures with massive, multifaceted eyes and dozens of bony, clicking legs. But the worst part was the faces. Thomas had repeatedly and obsessively drawn the face of a woman onto the thorax of each monster. A woman he had clearly known. The journal abruptly ends mid-sentence. The last word is washing. When the relief ship finally arrived 2 months later, Thomas was gone. The only things found were the open journal and 3 small, shallow pools of salt water on the stone walkway, even though the lighthouse had been sealed tight against the storm. The museum quietly archived the journal, deeming it the ravings of a mind broken by isolation. But the researcher, the user who posted this, swore that when she cataloged the entries, she recognized the woman's sketched face. It was the face of the former lighthouse keeper's wife, who had reportedly vanished at sea just a year before Thomas took the posting. He hadn't just been driven mad by the isolation, he had been driven mad by reunion. Our final tale comes from a former search and rescue operative who worked in the vast, dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. This user was the most prolific poster in the history of our /backwoods creepy before their account was abruptly deleted. The user, who we will call Jax, detailed an operation to find a missing elderly hiker in an area so remote it was not on any park maps. After 4 days, the search team found a derelict, unmarked log cabin deep in a narrow, forgotten valley. It was too old to be recent, yet too structurally sound to be a century old. It was simply there. They entered the cabin, hoping to find the hiker. The interior was furnished sparsely, with an old stove and a single, rickety cot. On the cot was a stack of paper, a meticulous, handwritten log by the missing hiker. The log started normally, entries about the weather, his path, and the wildlife. But about halfway through, the entries changed. The hiker started writing about the cabin's movement. He swore that every night, while he slept, the cabin would slightly shift its position, not rattle, but physically move, changing the view outside the window. The first day, he saw a distant mountain peak. The second day, a cluster of ancient, twisted trees. The third day, he recognized nothing but featureless, endless forest outside all 4 windows, which he swore hadn't been there the day before. The search team dismissed this as delirium. But then, Jax, the operative, noticed something terrifying on the cabin's exterior. On the side facing north, scratched deeply into the log wood, was a message, "I am found." The scratches were fresh, clearly done with a knife. The team continued to search the cabin's perimeter, finding nothing. They returned inside to collect the log and prepare to leave. It was then that the most impossible thing happened. As they stood in the silent cabin, Jax's partner shone his flashlight back toward the north wall where the inscription had been. The carving was gone. In its place, scratched with the same frantic hand, was a new message. This one was larger, deeper, and ran across 2 entire logs. "I am lost again." The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. The team rushed outside, looking for the hiker, convinced he was nearby. They searched the perimeter again. The cabin was exactly where it had been before. But when they looked back into the valley, they saw something that defies logic. Just 200 yards down the valley, in a small clearing, there was another cabin. Identical. Same derelict look, same materials, same placement of the windows. And as they stared at the second cabin, a door creaked open, and a figure, the missing hiker, stepped out. He raised his hand and waved, a gesture of pure, unnerving relief. But just as Jax was about to shout, the second cabin, with the hiker standing in the doorway, simply shimmered and vanished, leaving behind only a patch of untouched, dense forest. The team never found the missing man. They reported the second cabin as an optical illusion caused by exhaustion. But Jax never forgot the fear, the cold air, and the impossibility of that carved message. He believes that the original cabin is not a structure, but a predator that moves in the darkness of the narrow valleys. And when it finds you, you are never truly found again. These are the archives of the digital night. The raw, unverified accounts from the corners of the internet where people shed their skepticism and simply tell their story. When we look into these tales, the silent watcher, the sound from the crushing depths, the man with no face, the lighthouse keeper's sketches, or the cabin that hunted its occupant, we are forced to ask the terrifying question: what if the world is not the stable, predictable place we assume it is? The beauty of a fictional horror story is the safety of knowing that the monster stops when you close the book or turn off the screen. But these stories, submitted by people who swear they lived them, carry a different weight. They are the cracks in the wall. They are the whispers that tell us the darkness is real, and it is vast. It is easy to dismiss these users as crazy, as suffering from paranoia, isolation, or delusion. It is much harder to look at the consistent details, the shared terror, and the absolute finality of their fear, and remain convinced that everything is normal. We may never have concrete evidence for the silent watchers or the cabin that moved, but their stories remain, archived forever on the digital platform, waiting to be found by the next person looking for a scare. Be careful what you seek in the dark corners of the internet, and be even more careful what you share. Because sometimes, the scariest thing you'll find is the truth. If you have an unnerving true story of your own, share it below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the terrifying unknown, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the horror that hides in plain sight. Until the next transmission, stay safe and keep the light on.